Hi, I'm Sharon Bill. I think perhaps now it's time to consider how we feel about all of the change that's happened within the ABRSM exam system. I think the dust's settled and we can perhaps think a little more calmly now that we've gathered ourselves, and we can just reflect upon all of these changes to digital exams. There's no doubt about it that it's been a tempestuous time, and I am sure that it's been a troubled time for ABRSM also. The amount of effort that must have gone into steering all of these changes, it must be astronomical, rather like turning a massive cruise liner. And I think what's made it harder for us kind of on the ground as teachers and as students has been that it's come on the back of such a lot of change anyway. You know, we had 2 years really of lockdowns where so many things that we've become used to were no longer available to us. The exam centres were all closed. Going to your local teacher was no longer an option, even if for a short time we've had to consider other ways in which we can pursue our musical education within the confines of certain lockdown restrictions. And so there's been a lot of change for us all anyway, and then all of these changes have occurred where we now have to consider taking our music theory exam online at a computer, and therefore the responsibility falls upon the parent and the examinee rather than going to an exam centre. So it's more than just knowing your subject, isn't it? And then of course we've had the change to the performance exams where we can enter an exam, we can submit a recording for our exam. And as well, on top of that, if you're a pianist, the whole piano exam syllabus has changed, where we've had a massive overhaul of the scales and a lot of change in the style of pieces that we've been given. And I'm reminded of a time of change some decades ago in photography actually, where everything changed from film to digital. And even further back outside of my living memory and my grandma's living memory and many others, I'm looking back in history and I'm reminded of a time in industry when so much changed as well. One of my favourite novels is the novel Shirley by Bronte, and here we read about the tempestuous times and the troubled times of the frame breakers as manufacturing was turning to more mechanical rather than just, you know, human labour. And here, you know, I live quite close to the potteries, and that was a massive part of the history around here as you know, mechanisation took over and lots of people lost work in the potteries and also in the mining industry. And we go for a coffee in a little place where the venue used to be a bank, and so you can actually sit inside this big safe and drink a latte. And on the wall there is a picture of all of the local silk mills, which are quite near to where I live. It used to be a silk manufacturing town, and within just one stroke of the government's pen, all of those mills closed and manufacturing moved overseas, and again that happened in the potteries as well. And I think it's just brought home to me my whole point here. I seem to have digressed, but my point is that change is inevitable. Is it a change for the better? In many regards, I think it's redundant to ask that. It's a change, it's inevitable, and it's how do we respond to that change. So coming back to home, as it were, and the topic of exams in music being digital, and I have to think about how we're going to respond to that. And so with regard particularly to the music theory exam, where now it's taken on your computer, it's all online and it's multiple choice, you're not actually writing music, how do we feel about that as teachers? And I can see why it's happened. It's coming in line with the way a lot of GCSEs are taken and definitely how they're marked. And a lot of external sort of business exams in the financial sector, definitely, they all take their exams in this same way. So it's inevitable, it's an inevitable change. And how does that affect us academically in terms of music theory? And I think my response would be, I think it's actually made study harder. I think it's a shame that we don't necessarily have a pencil in our hand to take that exam. And this is where I really do think so much responsibility is placed upon the teachers to still advocate use of a pencil and to still kind of delegate homework where you write out extracts. We don't just teach to the test. If we want our students to be widely rounded musicians, it's our responsibility to not just teach to the test to pass the exam, but to still prescribe skills that would be beneficial to a musician. So as a teacher, I would always still require pencil and paper, manuscript paper, have these skills. But when it comes to the actual exam, I still require that you have a piece of scrap paper and a pencil in your hand, because you're going to have to just sketch things out and work things out. And my biggest advice in this respect would be, when you are answering questions for your online music theory exam, don't look at the options, don't even consider the multiple choice, work the answer out for yourself, and then move on to select the correct answer. In fact, I outline this more and more in my How to Take Your ABRSM Music Theory exam. It's a revised edition exactly for the online exam, and it helps you to just get the most out of your exam time. It's not just enough to know the subject, it's how to respond to the exam technique for the actual exam itself. I do think it's harder on the student. I do think it puts more responsibility on them, obviously, to host the exam and to run the technology at home. And that is the main concern, I think, that we're all finding, is that not everybody has the technology or the technical know-how in order to embrace this online exam. So I think, maybe our technological skills need to catch up with where we are in this. And so a lot of responsibility falls on parents, for example, there. And, that's going to take a little bit of working out, really. It's out of my hands as a teacher to help with that. But also, I do think it's quite tough in the marking scheme, because perhaps on a more written exam, if something was kind of right, you might just say there are 3 marks for that question. You might glean a mark for kind of getting a little bit of it right. Whereas now on the digital exam, when we are taking an exam on a computer and we're just clicking selected answers, there is no mark here or mark there for kind of a bit of the right answer. It's either right or it's wrong, and you've just either got those 3 marks or you've lost them. And I do think that makes the marking scheme quite tough. However, changes change, and I think it's incumbent upon us to respond to that change positively. Certainly as teachers it is, and whatever, music is music, and we continue to learn and we continue to grow as musicians, whatever the mechanics of that will be when it comes to exam time. Moving aside, looking at perhaps the performance exam now, again, another digital approach to taking an exam. After gathering our thoughts, we can now just consider what this means to us as teachers and how this is going to work for our students. And actually, on reflection, I do think this has now given us an extra string to our bow, if you'll pardon the pun. As musicians now, we have another opportunity, and it doesn't necessarily have to be better or worse, either or. It can be and both as well, because I've noticed that with the performance exam, I have found that the marking scheme is extremely strict. And so although on the one hand a student is now not being marked on scales or arpeggios or sight reading or oral, the fact that it's all entirely upon a musician's performance, and the marking is really, really rigorous. They are not just handing out exams just for playing a few tunes. That is not the case at all. And it's a rigorous exam, and it's easier said than done to sit in front of a camera and perform 4 pieces musically and flawlessly to gain a good mark. It sounds like it's an easy option, however it is not. Try it, and it's much trickier once you actually get down to the performance of that music. However, if you don't like it, if that is not a good option for your student and it's not really the appropriate avenue for them to take, we still have the face-to-face exams. And so we get the best of both worlds here. And now that perhaps we've lost the restrictions and exam centres are open to us again, we now get the benefit of choice, don't we? And so we can still take the traditional face-to-face exam, and whether you take that exam or not, again, I do believe it's the teacher's responsibility to make sure that we always teach and include scales, arpeggios, sight reading and oral in our lessons generally. Whether you're taking the face-to-face exam or any exam at all, it's still a really, really important factor in music education. And again, as a tutor, we want to provide a rounded education, not just teach to the test. And so I think from this we have to take away the fact that we have a lot of choice. And I know that one pupil of mine is certainly considering, I will take the performance and the face-to-face exam. I'm going to do both. It doesn't have to be either or. We have such a great opportunity of choice ahead of us. And yes, it's been a troubled time for sure. I think for all of us there's been an awful lot of change. However, change is inevitable. As musicians, as tutors, or even just as students, it's incumbent upon us to make sure that we approach our musical studies with a wide view, and we take bits from each section and we make sure that we have a wide education. The test is one little avenue. It's not the whole point. We don't just teach to pass a test. We teach to become musicians. We teach for a full-rounded musical education, and I think there's a lot for us to choose from. We've got a great opportunity within the ABRSM syllabus. It's been a lot to take in, but I think the dust has settled, and I do think that as teachers and as students we're beginning to find our way. Thanks for listening. Bye.